Hi, my name is Kalpesh, and I am one of the panel captain for this panel. This is my third year into volunteering, and it is my great privilege to introduce you with Professor Stuart Madnick, who is also IC3 director. Cybersecurity initiative started at MIT. And without further ado, Professor Madnick.
Thank you, Kalpesh, very much. I appreciate it. So I'm going to try a new technology. Thank you. I'm going to try a new technology today, which I'm going to call artificial virtual reality. See, there's supposed to be a screen behind me with a projector. So I want you to visualize the screen with projectors. So there's a couple introductory slides I was going to go over, which we will do that virtual way instead. So first I want to give you a couple I call fun facts. A study indicated that human error and not technology is the primary risk factor for cybersecurity. According to this one study, 95% of successful cyber attacks result or as an aftermath of a phishing scam. And we had a lot of conversation at the break about all kinds of phishing exercises that people do. But what's fascinating, we talked a lot about training also. 78% of people claim that they know that there's risks from clicking links that they don't know. Yet most of them will still click such links. So the mere fact that you're aware doesn't always necessarily affect your behavior. And finally, the total cost of cybercrime is expected to hit around $6 trillion by 2021. It's a mere $3 trillion now. Now, that's not the amount of money stolen. It includes cost of setting up defenses. It costs changes to your operations in order to deal with these issues. So it's these are all the extra costs that are incurred or that would not have been incurred if we did not have any cyber events at all. So these are some fun facts, if you will. Now, as many of you know, we're going to have you ask us questions. But I thought I'd take initiative here and ask you some questions first. So the first question is, how many of you have had a cyber attack at some time or other? I will close my eyes. Okay. So a little over, it looks like about half of you have. So it turns out, and once again, your experience may be different, but according to various studies, the average organization takes about 297, you say 200, apparently it's 197 days before a attack is breached. And the final fun fact, according to a recent interview with Warren Buffett, if you know, he views cyber attacks as the greatest threat to mankind, even a greater threat than nuclear weapons. I haven't asked him kind of, how much he views nuclear weapons as a threat, but definitely he views cyber crime. So these are just a little bit to get a kind of sense of why we're all very excited to be here and to share some of our experience and thoughts with you. So finally, before I turn it over to my panel, I have two last questions for you. First question, show of hands, how many of you in your organization have a Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO of some kind? So it looks like maybe about half of them. And so the question we're going to be asking later on, and maybe you can answer it now first for your own organization. In your organization, who does the CISO report to? How many of them have report to the CIO? A handful. How many report to the CEO? Almost as many. How many report to the Chief Financial Officer, CFO? Anybody? How about the Chief Risk Officer? How many report to somebody else? It seemed like there were more hands went up before said they had a CISO than they respond to who they report. Maybe some CISOs report to nobody. That talk about someone really got a great job. So with that kind of as a bit of a warm-up, what I want to do is I've asked each of our panelists to take just a minute or two first to introduce themselves, but to answer one question for them in their organization. What do they see, or what is the role of the CIO in their organization? Just a brief statement just to get a sense of where we're coming from. So if I can start you off, Bob?
Don. Sure.
Don.
So I'm Don Anderson. I'm CIO at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston here. I've been in that role for a little bit more than 3 years. But before that, I spent over 10 years building a large part of the cybersecurity defense team for the entire Federal Reserve that's located here in Boston. So traditionally, if you've been over to the Fed, our building is right across from South Station. Largely, we're concerned about the $5 billion worth of cash that's in our vault that comes and goes every day through banks throughout New England. But more so, we're focused on the $20 trillion of cash and money and whatnot that comes across our applications every day. So obviously, cybersecurity is very important to us. Using the example you were just talking about, imagine one day if we wake up and somebody has found a way to zero out that balance. And pretty much everybody's balance, every bank is gone, wiped out within a moment. So largely, that's where we focus our cybersecurity efforts on. So in our case, our CISO reports to me. And I think in our case, it's been beneficial because of my cybersecurity background. I just view it as another risk. There's cybersecurity risk, there's operational risk, there's liquidity risk, there's reputational risk, and it's just one thing that I have to bring together in that big picture.
Excellent. Lev?
Yeah, so I work for
Lev, introduce yourself, please.
Oh, yeah. So my name is Lesokhin, and I work for CAST, which is a software company. So our own cybersecurity concerns are, I would say, relatively minimal. But we do a lot of work in the application security space. And really, all of my background, actually, since the early 90s, has been in application development and kind of the apps side of the IT house, if you will. And one thing that, I guess it's another fun fact, but there's kind of a statistic that I've seen recently that I think is interesting, which relates to one of the things that you said, Stuart, earlier, which is that 84% of attacks actually these days are happening at the application layer, which I don't know if that surprises anybody. And I think, and I see a lot of conversations around security that, I've been involved in lately, and a lot of them actually in DC with some folks that, out of DHS and kind of the DC cybersecurity community. And one of the things that we started hearing, I think 3 to 4 years ago now, was that you can basically assume that the adversary is inside your network. So the kind of last line of defense now is at the application, the data layer. And that's kind of what I've been seeing and hearing in this space.
And back to my question, what do you see as the role of the CIO in dealing with these issues?
So this may be a lengthy answer.
Oh, well, give us the abbreviated version now.
Okay.
We can elaborate it later.
So all right, the abbreviated version, and if you want me to elaborate, I will, is that I think that the role of the CISO, and there are many fine people that are in the CISO role, I think that the role of the CISO actually gets in the way of the CIO being successful in making their applications and their data secure. Because I think actually what we just heard from Don, right? I'm getting the names. It's like you put two names in front of me. So you have a security background, and you have a concern, probably a fundamental concern about security, and I think that that's relatively rare among CIOs. And so my feeling is that the role of the CIO in cybersecurity should be to own the problem completely, soup to nuts. And I don't think that that's the case today, because the CISO is there, and you can sort of delegate that problem to the CISO and wash your hands of it. That's my view.
So Lena, before I let Lena go on, I told her that she had a very fascinating example when I asked the question of, who does the CISO report to, or so on. At one time, she was both the CIO and the CISO, so I asked her, who did she report herself to? So Lena, introduce yourself, please, and say a little bit about what you think the role of the CIO is.
Okay, so I'm Lena Smart. I am the CISO for Tradeweb. We're an anonymous trading company. We do trading on the institutional platform, retail, and interdealer broker. I call us the Match.com for Wall Street. So a lot of money goes through our books as well. So we're obviously very concerned with being hacked. We don't have money on our books. It just flows through our systems. So my background is obviously I'm not American, as you can probably tell. The more astute of you. I'm from Scotland. And so I moved here about 22 years ago. So I worked for a power company for 18 years. I rose from being in the help desk to being their CISO and then their CIO. And then they couldn't find a CISO, so I was both. And then I left. And then I joined Tradeweb 2 years ago. And I love it. I have the best job on the planet. I get paid to do a hobby. I get where you're coming from, absolutely. Because when I was CISO, I was the thorn in my CIO's side. And I learned very quickly when I became CIO, even though I was both, because I was a pain in my own side then, that it's sometimes really hard to balance security with the business, and that's the big balancing act that I do just now. So I report to our Chief Technical Officer. We don't have a CIO. And I also report to the Chief Administrative Officer, so he's our head lawyer. So I have the technologist and the lawyer. That's awesome. But they give me a lot of latitude. So they give me, they know that they pay me to do a job. I do the job. I think I do it quite well, and I keep them in the loop. And I work very closely with the business, and I also have a good relationship with the head of infrastructure and the head of risk. So we're kind of this triangle. There's the CIA triangle, where we're the risk, cyber, infrastructure. It's not even a good acronym for that. So we meet regularly, and it's kind of 2 against 1, and it's usually me and risk against infrastructure. So a lot of the information that maybe you used to get hit with as the CIO, and it was a pain in the neck to deal with, we keep it below the CIO level. We deal with it before he even gets to see it. So he just gets to see the solutions that the business has come up with. So.
Lance.
Yeah, great. I'm Lance Weaver. I am the product strategy lead and emerging services lead for Equinix. Equinix is a global data center and interconnection provider. So what that means is we have 200 data centers around the globe, and we provide connectivity to organizations large and small, to network service providers. About 80 to 90% of the world's internet flows through Equinix. So we have a certain perspective on security concerns around that infrastructure. Prior to joining Equinix, I was a CISO for a large, Fortune 10 GE, which is headquartered here in Boston now. And I spent a number of years also as a CTO within the organization. So I have, perspective of, operational, actions for security within IT, and my role now at Equinix is producing new security products, that help to secure cloud properties, secure internet properties, and then also delivering products in other areas like data and application infrastructure. My view on the CIO and CISO alignment is, I think from a CIO standpoint, that operationalizing security within the organization is critical, and realistically the CIO has a purview across the organization to ensure risk management. So as we see more digital transformation occurring, more companies delivering digital products, the ability to own and integrate that fully within the company's process is very important, and managing that at a global scale to ensure that at the enterprise level, the company level, that they're able to actually manage the risk, not just within one function.
Excellent, thank you. So I have a quick question. How many of you in the audience here are either CIOs or part of the CIO organization in your company? Pretty much most of you, which is what I expected. So I'm going to tell a quick little story, which I think will piggyback on the several of the points they mentioned. How many of you have ever been in one of these new hotels where you can unlock your hotel room door with your smartphone? How many of you? Some of you have done that. I was at the New York Hilton. I don't know if you saw the story. About 6 or 8 months back, an Austrian hotel was hit with a ransomware attack that locked all of the doors in the hotel. Now the good news is you could get out of your room. Still can turn the knob to get out. You just couldn't get back in your room until the hotel paid the ransomware fine or the demand. What was fascinating, what do you think the manager of the hotel did after that event? Anybody want to guess? Anybody read the article? Back to manual locks. Now, the reason I'm saying this, my next question is going to be for our panelists, like each of them, if they can comment upon it. There is this, I call, tension between innovation, like putting in smart locks, and the possibility of it introducing new security concerns. And how do you balance these concerns of kind of moving, in some sense you're moving forward with 1 foot on the gas pedal and 1 foot on the brake. And how do you balance that in your organization? So each of you get to comment upon, A, do you sense this tension? And 2, how do you deal with this tension?
Sure. So at the Fed, up until probably 4 or 5 years ago, information security was the people that always said no. You know, you didn't even bother asking for permission because you knew what they were going to say. And we've changed that around. We've changed our team. We've changed our leadership. That their job is not to say yes or no. Their job is to figure out how to do something securely. So that's great. They're getting engaged earlier on in the process. There's a lot of things that we're a risk-averse organization. Like, we don't like any risk at all. But if we're going to innovate, we have to do things. So, and I think that that's the tone right from the top, is that I'm willing to take those risks. I'm willing to sign off on them, but we take an iterative approach to it. So what that means is 5 years ago, we started on a blockchain proof of concept. So we have the general ledger for the Fed, and we looked at, you know, what would it look like if we were to put the general ledger out in the blockchain? And, you know, we didn't have the hardware to do it internally. It just wouldn't make sense to do it there. So we put it out in the public cloud. And that original risk document that we put together was, we just really don't know what it is. We don't know what the risk is at that point of blockchain. We don't know what the risk of is with this specific cloud provider. But at that same point then, we weren't putting, obviously, production data or critical data or anything like that. So we were kind of putting our toe in the water, and then the business kind of said, okay, we want to do a little bit more. And we went a little bit further in security, and so on and so forth. So we're not making these gigantic investments in security risk management until we really know where the business wants to go. And I think that tone right from the top shows that we are willing to innovate, we are willing to take risks, but we're going to do it deliberately.
You want to add to that?
Yeah, so just kind of more from the application perspective, that's because that's my background. But you know, everything about security right now, the way the industry approaches it, is kind of a bolt-on, right? So you know, so when you're designing capabilities, you know, software capabilities, security really is kind of an afterthought. And actually, it's interesting. I was just reading up on this recently. That like in terms of because you can make a lot of analogies between software development certainly. And buildings, you know, physical structures, right? And actually, back in the 19th century, you know, we had a lot of fires, and you know, and at some point, I think in 1860, actually, there was a big fire in New York City. Elm Street tenement burned down. A bunch of people died. Finally, there was an outcry, and there was a regulation that said, you know, you have to have some sort of secondary egress, so kind of a security metaphor there that's very apt. And you know, so we see a bunch of bolted-on fire escapes, right, that are still there. We can still see them, right? But if you're building a building now, a modern building, that security is built in. You know, you've got fireproof, you know, construction. You've got secondary exits. You know, for the really tall buildings, the core is, you know, used as the escape route. You know, that you can. It's not permeable to fire. And so when you get to the, you know, the point, just coming back to the point, when you get to designing the systems that run, like, I don't know, the door locks in a hotel, or that run, you know, that manage the money that gets traded, or the check handling through the Federal Reserve, or whatever, you know, security needs to be part of the feature set. The same, you know, the same as all the stories that you put up in you know, on your Kanban board or in your Agile board, all the stuff that you're building in for functionality. You know, the security needs to be designed in at that point, right? And it's not currently today. It's not viewed that way. It's viewed as kind of this obstacle. So I kind of challenge that fundamental trade-off. I think that it just needs to be part of the feature set.
It's a good point. I'll come back to it, but we've done studies, and you're right, that this is a change taking place in some organizations where, as you said, rather than being a bolt-on, it's part of the initial step. Lena.
I think it depends the kind of business that you're trying to innovate. The finance industry that I'm in, I mean, we're not top of the list for innovation, but we're definitely trying to get there. But at the same time, we have regulators, you know, breathing down our necks, telling us what we can and can't do. So we have the New York State DFS, we have the SEC, CFTC, there's just this alphabet soup, and of course there's GDPR coming out on Friday. That'll be fun. And so, you know, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, because now I don't know if it's Bob or Fred or Don. My apologies. This is all Lev's fault.
Everyone will know my name.
I said Don.
They took off our name badges, so we just don't know who each other is. So the guy in the end. I'm of the same pragmatic of view. Our risk tolerance is, you know, less than zero. You know, our clients expect us to look after their trades. And if we're trying to be innovative and it causes us to lose money, the reputational risk alone would be very bad for our company. So slow and steady wins the race, really. I think it depends what business you're in.
Yeah, I think, from my opinion, innovation is critical in almost every business, right, to succeed. And that does, have, some form of risk taking that's necessary in it. But I think in a lot of cases, internal processes, and people, trying to figure out how to innovate, they really don't. They take a longer term view than what the risk is on the front end of testing an idea. So like my group is, that's our job, like, incubating new ideas and trying to turn it into a product. You can get bogged down in the longer term view of what that would look like at scale. And I think if you back up, you can really find that, there are a lot of things that you can de-risk on the front end simply because of the fact that it is a limited exposure. And if you take that view, you will have much faster innovation while still maintaining the security side. As you begin to scale, totally with Lev on that, you have to build it in. It has to be part of your process. If you hear DevOps on the Agile side, you'll hear DevSecOps on the security side. So it's an absolute requirement. But I think on the front end you can decide how much actual exposure there is in testing this idea.
Now, I don't know whether this may be a phenomenon because most of you are from relatively mature organizations, but one of the things we often do in our research group here is work with a number of startups, particularly companies in the IoT, Internet of Things space and so on. I'll tell you a little story. I'm not telling you the punchline, could let you figure it on your own, but the story goes as follows. They're about to come out with a new product. I don't know the details of it, but an IoT product. And right before they're going to launch it, they realized there was a security vulnerability in it. And to fix the vulnerability, it turns out the hardware that they assembled together would not be capable of doing it. It would require a complete redesign in at least 6 months. And this was a product they thought would be a big player, and there were a lot of competitors about to come out. So they had a decision to make, to hold back the product, redesign it, and launch it 6 months later, quite likely having lost the market window. Or launch the product now and hope that no one would notice the problem until they fix it sometime in the future. I will leave it to your imagination as to which one they picked. So I think the issue may be is that different companies may be at different stages, different cultures, different attitudes. I don't know whether you've seen that in any, maybe not in your company, but you see this issue where some are actually willing to take maybe too big a risks. You see that at all happening?
So I mean, using IoT as an example, so our building was 40 years old and we're really focusing on efficiency and greenhouse gas and all the other stuff. And IoT is the way that we've got to get to that at that point now. I mean, automating shades and sensors in every room and everything else. We make the assumption that IoT is not secure.
Okay.
So we have put controls around it and walls, and in some cases there's humans that have to double check things before. Because if we wait, if we go through this huge, gigantic review, it's going to take us years to get there. Or if we wait until that product comes out that's able to assure 100% security, we're going to miss our window to leverage that technology.
Okay, so you do have that phenomenon. We have to realize that there are cases when you are willing to, or you have to deal with things that may be insecure.
Yep.
Now, once again, I think our panelists here may be a little bit atypical, but here's the question I was going to ask. How much knowledge of cybersecurity should a CIO have? Now, many of you have deep backgrounds in it, so you may not be typical, but of course you know other CIOs in general. What's your view? Let's start maybe at the end for a change.
Yeah.
How much should a CIO know about cybersecurity?
Yeah, it's definitely my view that a CIO should know a lot about cybersecurity. Should have depth of knowledge in this space, primarily because CIO plays a chief role in that digital transformation journey. And in so doing, being able to protect those digital products, right? The engagement, not just the back-end systems, right? And customer data in that regard, but the delivery of those digital products to the customer. That's the interface point in digital business. The CIO absolutely needs to be able to, fundamentally understand security and the impacts of decisions, the risk choices that we were talking about in trying to deliver.
Lena? You want to add anything?
I would say a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. I'm sure we've all worked with people who come in on a Monday morning having read a magazine on Saturday night. They're like, we have to do this. So I've worked with a few people, not recently, like that. And so from a purely selfish point of view, I'd prefer the CIO knew nothing about cybersecurity and just let me get on with it. But that's not the real world. I mean, in all honesty, it's good to have an in-depth conversation with your boss if he or she is a CIO, because they'll get it. You don't need to spend 5 hours explaining what cryptography is or what ransomware is or why we have to spend $500,000 on a black box that they don't even know how to turn on. And so I think that definitely helps. So it's a kind of double-edged sword.
Yeah.
My view is that actually the CIO needs to know the basics of, what are the areas of cybersecurity that they need to be concerned about. But they don't need, it's impossible for the CIO to have deep knowledge of every area of cybersecurity, right? Because you have, in addition to AppSec, the area that I'm interested in, but, there's intrusion detection, there's, the network security, I don't know, the person, endpoint device security. There's so many areas of security, right? But what I think the CIO does need to do is keep themselves informed and to know how to ask the right questions and to have some sort of scorecard or status of the security health of the various layers of technology that they're managing, right? So that they can see where the risks are, where the hotspots are, whether they're improving or not. This is what we're kind of calling software intelligence from a software standpoint, but obviously what the CIO needs to care about is not just the software, the full field.
So in our organization, we have it as a goal as our executive committee needs to know our top vulnerabilities, our top risks, and our top adversaries. And that really helps us with, I had that same issue where every Saturday morning somebody read an article in the Wall Street Journal and, what are we doing about this? And it really has helped our leadership focus on what the key issues are. And again, people don't have to be experts, but they understand at least, what are the 5 things that I should care about today.
So the question, I think in the Fed, you've got actually several CIOs at each one. So you're obviously one with a lot of deep background. Is that typical, or are you kind of atypical of the other CIOs, would you say?
So I'm atypical in many ways.
I won't ask in all the ways, but maybe a few of the ways.
No, I think I think I'm the only one with the security background. But everybody appreciates it and has a good CISO working with them.
So here's a question, not all of you have to answer, but let me see which ones you want to volunteer this. I've talked to a number of consultants particularly, and they say one of the big challenges they have when they talk to a company trying to help them, they find that many companies haven't thought about the issue of what are their crown jewels. In other words, if you try to protect everything, I use the analogy at MIT, there'd be 10,000 doors at MIT. It'd be ideal if all of them were locked all the time when they should be locked, but that's that spreads your energy wrong. Which doors are really the most important ones? And the comment was he finds that many companies really haven't thought that way. And of course, that makes it very hard to know how to focus your energy. First, have you seen or heard that issue, and how do you deal with that issue? Anyone who volunteer?
Yes, so we had that issue. We had 6,000 applications, and everybody said everything was priority 1. So about 2 years ago, we went through and we ranked at least the 1 to 100. And those are the apps now that we focus on. And we have an up-to-date database in terms of vulnerability and stance. So an example where that came in really well was when the Struts vulnerability came out about a year and a half ago that hit Equifax. Within an hour, we knew in that top 100 what applications were vulnerable, and we were able to remediate them quickly. And we also knew whether they were externally or internally and whatever. So, pretty much by end of day, we were able to quantify what that risk was and have a plan.
Anybody else want to comment?
Yeah, I would add, based on my prior experience at GE, we absolutely did go through and inventory, right, the value of the applications, and that was based on a few characteristics in order to protect them, right? But one of those was personal safety, right? So were products that we put out, could it affect personal safety? And that was number one. Intellectual property, as an example, was another chief characteristic, and it was highly dependent upon the cycle of the business. Was it a long cycle business, short cycle business? So I think it's really important to break it down specifically for your business, what is the most important characteristic, right? What is it that you're trying to protect in order to avoid the 6,000 doors or 10,000 doors? You cannot do it that way. But if you really get down to the crown jewels, that's a much smaller subset. To put that in context, within GE, we had 9,000 applications, right? Of those that actually got tagged as crown jewels, it was not a published number. What I can say, it was less than 50, right? And if you take that into perspective, then you can apply proper security controls against things that you truly care about.
Excellent. Let me change gears. Once again, a question for the audience here. How many in your organization are already doing anything substantial using the cloud? How many there are at least partially or in the cloud? Okay, I'd say maybe well over 2/3. Let me ask the same question about panelists. Show of hands. How many of you have significant applications in the cloud? Okay. So my question is going to be, I'll ask all four of you the question, but does going to the cloud increase your security, decrease your security, or does it depend? And if it depends on what? Who wants to be the first? Who raised the hand about being in the cloud?
I'll take it.
Okay,
sure. Yeah, so for sure, right? Cloud adoption, and so we have resources in the cloud. My prior role, one of them, when I was at GE, was actually CTO for cloud. So it was, could we go adopt public cloud services for all apps? And so, being able to understand then what was good and bad, what were the problems, the challenges that we, thought that we could solve with the cloud, versus what did we need to keep independent or cloud neutral. Those are assessments that we did across the board in that stratification of applications. As an example, we did low, medium, high, and crown jewels as risk categories for our apps. The requirements and architecture for each of those categories was different. But to answer the question from my view, could we be more secure in the cloud? Absolutely, right? I think it's a matter of not assuming that your security is the cloud, but is the tooling within it that you can take advantage of. And then you also need to have a posture of what do you want to maintain control of and outside of the cloud, such that you can apply the same policy across all of those resources, whether it be a public cloud provider or a SaaS provider.
Now, I think you're the other cloudy person.
Right. Let me be a little more clear than cloudy. But no, actually, I think the two questions that you asked are actually related between crown jewels and the kind of this application selection topic that we've been talking about. So if you're just lifting and shifting, because the way you move to cloud, there's different things you can do with cloud,
yeah,
right?
Sure.
So if you're just lifting and shifting, it's probably neutral in terms of security, right? Maybe you could say that a class 5 data center that Amazon runs is more secure than the one that you can run yourself. Maybe not, it's arguable, I don't know. But in the end, then it comes back to that application layer and how secure you are at the application layer. And, and then you've got the same set of issues, whether you're in cloud or on-prem. But if most of the interesting things that are going on around cloud is actually, decomposing your applications, building microservices, starting to take advantage of past capabilities on cloud. And this is where, I would kind of challenge the notion of crown jewels being, I think in a lot of organizations, crown jewels are still kind of at the application layer, but the notion of an application is starting to get broken down, I think. So it's getting a little bit cloudy around the edges. What is an application? Because you've got APIs in some cases. You've got different services that serve different applications, and we see this all the time when we're analyzing applications. It's hard to figure out where the boundaries are and what you need to analyze, and so it becomes more a question of which business processes and how do they touch the PII that you're trying to protect. And there, I think that the cloud migration is kind of part of that digital transformation that we've been talking about, right? And I think, again, I'm kind of coming back to the point that the level of sophistication and how we're architecting security into these APIs and microservices is not nearly where it needs to be. And we're kind of losing an opportunity, frankly, with this transformation that we're all going through. And we're not really engineering security.
So let me just play back what I think you're saying, because I think it's important point. A lot of the sessions today have talked about digital transformation, and in some sense it's an opportunity for many purposes, but one of the purposes to rethink the way in which you're looking at and dealing with security And many people, that's not part of the opportunity they're taking advantage of.
That's right. The last time that we had a major re-engineering of our applications was when I was at Sloan, which was at Y2K. And so it's been 18 years, and now we're kind of re-engineering. It's not deadline driven, but everyone's kind of doing it.
Once every 20 years sounds about right.
Yeah, and it's an opportunity, and I think we're kind of missing it.
Now, take the flip side of this, Lena and Don. Was the issue of security at all a factor in why you're not maybe more aggressively in the cloud, or how does that fit into your process?
Our clients just aren't interested in a cloud-based solution just now. So, our clients are our money generators, so why would we go against that?
Okay.
I mean, we're looking at it for our corporate side of the house, definitely, and then using the experiences there. And we have a cloud team that reports to the CTO, and they're working on several innovative things. But for just now, we're keeping the model as is because it works and it's not broken.
And Don?
So ours is just the culture of the organization being very risk adverse. I mean, we're getting there now. I mean, we're moving every day. We're moving hundreds of applications to it.
So there is application in the cloud. Oh, there are some.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, not critical stuff yet. But our challenge has been how do we get the level of assurance? Obviously, when something is in your hands, you can attest to security controls. If you're relying on a vendor, you have to rely on whatever it is that they give you, and that's where we've kind of struggled. But I think even that now we're at the point of okay, here's a gray area. Are we willing to take a risk on that or not?
Because I don't know exactly your own personal case, but I think every organization is kind of struggling with this because the incentives, or at least the hype about moving into the cloud is very high. So it's hard not to be thinking about it. I talked to someone who said the U.S. government is moving into the cloud. My response is, I thought we were in the cloud all along. But in any case, a lot of organizations are kind of moving that way. Now the question is going to be how fast and how carefully do they move. So this is probably something that's going to continue to be on people's attention for quite a while. Now, I have a kind of a related question, not directly related or limited to the cloud, but the question would be is to what extent do you find you have to share either your data or access to your system with third parties, either for lots of different reasons? And if so, what challenges does that pose and how do you deal with those challenges? Does that issue apply to any of you here? I see some nods at that end of the room.
I mean, to a small extent, Equinix is one of our vendors, so so they're in our network. Yeah, I mean, we have policies and procedures around that. There has to be something written down that they know the steps to take if someone has to come into our network. It's funny, you just mentioned this. I got an email literally 2 minutes before we came on saying our physical security guy, he wants this third party to come in and look at our HVAC. All I thought of was Target. We're just going to be hacked, and it's going to be Target all over again. And it's just, sitting with the guy and understanding what he needs, and so they understand what two-factor authentication means, and just making things a wee bit more secure.
So I'm not sure, you mentioned Target. I'm not sure, once again, a lot of these stories are anecdotal, so I'm not sure how precise they are, but supposedly in the case of the Target break-in, many may be familiar with it, was actually accessed through, I think it was the air conditioning maintenance company that didn't have particularly good security. So hackers got into them. They then had access to the corporate computers of Target in order to schedule the maintenance activity. So having kind of got in through a back door, then they weasel their way into the central computers. So
I read something recently about a fish tank, and that's just popped into my head there. Does anyone remember that story?
Which one?
Good, I'm not going mad. The gentleman there with the Vegas. That's it.
Yeah.
Wow.
So one of the big
Thank you.
issues that's going on in many companies, and I see this actually, one of my former students is kind of in the mergers and acquisitions part of a company. And one of the concerns they have when they buy a new company, the question is what are they bringing indoors, so to speak, bringing in-house, if you will, in terms of how secure was that company they just bought. So there's this issue of, not only do you have to worry about the security within our own walls, but into all the partners who in one way or another are connected to us. But I don't know if you wanted to elaborate.
Yeah, you had two parts there, right? One was the sharing of that info to third parties, and the other is access to, right? So on the access to front, it's a critical issue. You've got a ton of third-party contractors, other companies, partners that you're dealing with. So a couple of ways that we take advantage of is certainly auditing those third parties to ensure that they are implementing controls in and of their own right. And then at the access side, is not doing the traditional network-based VPN, but doing an application-based VPN, such that the access is restricted to a particular application, and that it's user context aware, right? So who is getting into it, not what, in that case. And so preventing access is a big part of it. In distribution of data, so we share to our customer base, right? Our data that we collect as IoT for our data centers, right? And we redistribute that to them. They can access that over APIs, and so API security becomes paramount in how do you prevent DDoS against it? How do you do rate limiting? What level of security do you apply in session keys? There are various avenues to do that against an API set. But ultimately, you're trying to restrict who is accessing it, and then ultimately what they have access to through that API.
Exactly. For those who may have been here, the session in this room just before us talked about platforms and APIs, and this is once again kind of the double-edged sword, if you will. In many ways, back to kind of your strategy, many times your strategy includes trying to find ways to better connect with your customers, better connect with your suppliers, providing APIs and access for them. On the one hand, that's a very important strategic advantage you can provide. At the same time, it may also be opening up vulnerabilities. So this is kind of why it's a challenge. Yes?
Yeah, one thing that we're actually seeing, there's at the software layer, there's a new standard that is actually developed here at Object Management Group here in Boston called the CISC, Consortium for IT Software Quality. And so they've come up with a set of standards for reliability, performance efficiency, security of software, and we're starting to see. I think they have a way to kind of certify a piece of software against that standard. We're starting to see that being used in some places to sort of show that that you've got a certain level of security behind an API.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm going to change gears a little bit to a topic that also I think was mentioned briefly a little bit today. I don't know how many people in the audience are familiar with GDPR, which is the data protection and privacy regulations of the EU. Once again, it's relatively new. I'm not sure if it's a week now. I'm not sure exactly how long it's been in effect. But
That's
even
right.
though it's
May 18th.
In 2 days.
2 days, okay. 15th, I thought it was. In any case, the issue is even though this is the United States, because of the way it's broadly defined, it has implications, particularly for companies that operate in Europe, but also companies that deal with EU citizens. Right. And of course, some people view it as kind of a possible model. So for lots of reasons, it has gotten a lot of attention. Having said that, my question is, how does it impact cybersecurity? Does it help, hurt, or neutral?
I don't think anyone knows yet.
An honest answer.
I honestly, has anyone read the papers for GDPR? It's like 250 pages of gobbledygook. And I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but that coupled with Brexit is just, it's a whole new world. We've opened, we're opening a new office, to deal with Brexit, and we're taking on more staff to deal with GDPR, to deal with the questionnaires that we get from our clients, asking what are we doing. So,
anybody else want to comment? Any further thoughts about it?
I would say, just the ramification of the details is, still yet to be sorted out. I do think there are a lot of good practices, within the GDPR, and that will, and it has enough enforcement. 4% of revenues is enough to get attention that companies will take notice and take action accordingly. So there's references in GDPR to protect your data by encrypting it, right? And that is a very good practice of how you can protect info regardless of where it's sitting. It does transfer the issue to the keys, the encryption keys used for the data, so you have to have a plan for that. There are methods out there, to solve for that. But realistically, I think the GDPR regulations will help, more consistency and more push into organizations that may have been taking a lighter view on security.
Let me give you 2 examples I heard mentioned to me and see if you see your thoughts about this. One of the things that GDPR requires, as I recall, I've not worked my way through the hundreds of pages of gobbledygook, but that if there is a breach, you must disclose it to the affected parties within 72 hours. I have heard, at least in the United States, a number of times, either the police or the FBI have asked a company to specifically not reveal because they were in the middle of trying to do a tracing through to find out who the bad guys were. And by announcing that you know that they've been broken into would cause them to scurry away and therefore interfere with the criminal investigation. So in that case, if you would take the rule as written seriously, it would interfere with that kind of behavior. Is that something you've heard of as an issue or not, for example?
Well, yeah, I definitely have. I would say two things, right? One, just going back to that data encryption side, if the data is encrypted, that isn't the requirement, right? So that plays another critical role in again, that best practice story. But I think it is a legitimate, argument that, exposure of too much information too quickly in that regard, could, unfortunately cause additional ripple effects. If unfortunately the malicious or, threat actors out there know that it has happened and that information spreads more quickly, then you can certainly have a, negative impact that, wasn't intended by having those requirements.
So I'm going to take two hype topics and merge them together and then throw cybersecurity into the mix as well. I've already talked about GDPR, but there's also blockchain. And once again, some people have argued that GDPR and blockchain may be in fact at odds with each other because one of the premises of GDPR is the notion of right to be forgotten. One of the notions of blockchain is nothing is ever forgotten. So there's an issue there as to whether both can coexist. But my real question is, do you see blockchain, which is something that, let me show of hands, how many people here in their organizations are at least experimenting and looking at blockchain? So, small number, but maybe a quarter or so of the audience. So my question is blockchain something that's going to help, hurt, or be neutral to cybersecurity? Any of you want to take a crack at that?
So we're looking, I can't address the right to be forgotten,
Sure.
but the right to be remembered is something, we're looking at the blockchain as, initially when we started on it 5 years ago, it was all about resiliency. Was there a way that we can, put additional controls on top of just a normal database? And we thought blockchain may be that answer.
Okay. So, yeah, you comment?
Yeah, I was to say, so I mean, the audit trail associated with blockchain, immutable ledgers, is critical. Right? I mean, that gives you the ability for truly tracing, interaction. At the end of the last panel, one of the examples was, with API. API exposure, if you were backing that with blockchain, would be the ability to have that audit trail available for every transaction, everything that occurred, and make that available to the right parties, securely. So I think that it's obviously very early days, but I think there is actually a great, opportunity for leveraging blockchain to improve security.
Excellent. So I'm going to do is switch the gears down to the audience. I'm going to take a few of the questions from the Slido, then I'm going to revert back to a cyber safe technology, which is show of hands, for other questions as well. So let me take one or two questions. I'm not sure exactly what they had in mind, but I'll give you the question. You can decide how you want to respond to it. Key management, how can we manage it best? Anybody want to take a stab at that issue? Look like you're...
Yeah, I'll do that one just because of the references to the GDPR and data encryption side. So because encryption being a key element in control of data, with key management, you have to be able to protect the keys that have encrypted the data. So where do you house them? How do you control them? And then how does that apply globally, right? So can you, globally control and manage those keys where you're doing your digital business, right? That's adoption of various cloud services. So as you're looking at that, you have to figure out, can I maintain ownership of them? And there are cases where government compulsion is at play here. So there are cases where you wouldn't want to actually host those keys within a provider and suffer a failure where they got an NSL, national security letter, and it had a gag order, and so therefore both your keys and your data are gone, right? And you just don't know about it, and they're not able to tell you. So protections, against that, are separating the keys from the lock, right? Keys from the encrypted data. So hosting that separately, within your control is a best practice in order to prevent that sort of issue from occurring.
Excellent. Another good, fascinating question, which I'll break it into two parts. The question posed was CISOs are expensive and hard to find, so I'd like to get your reaction to it. Those of you who are underpaid CISOs should talk to that person. But the other question is, in general, do you find, because obviously this whole cybersecurity issue has been exploding very rapidly, how much difficulty do you find in just staffing in general? So both CISOs in particular, but also staffing in general. Any of you want to take a crack at that question?
Well, I can.
Okay, good.
You go.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I find it very difficult to find staff because we're in Jersey City, which is a ferry ride away from Manhattan. So, you have Google, you have FANG. So, I mean, they just add a 0. Then there's Wall Street, they just add 2 zeros. So we have difficulty. I mean, everybody in Jersey City has difficulty getting staff.
I guess the other question would be, maybe elaborate, but what have you found any clever trick, to get them? Or any clever idea you found to deal with that challenge? The reason I mentioned the other part of it, I should have mentioned the second part of that question, which I wasn't sure I've heard this term before, and that's a vCISO. I guess that's a virtual CISO. I'm not quite sure what that is, but
Oh no, I've seen the CISO for hire thing. Yeah, I've seen that. That's bizarre. I mean, it's a good idea if you like. It was bizarre to me. It's like giving
Bunch
the
of guys
keys to the
in
kingdom
India.
to some stranger. And, no, they're usually in San Francisco for some reason. No offense. But it's just as kind of a bizarre idea to me. But I'm paranoid anyway, so I just don't know why I'd give a complete stranger.
did you want to comment upon the issue of CISOs? And,
Because of the San Francisco
We're like best friends now.
There's some in New York as well.
No, I think it's well, in a lot of cases like other technologies, it's about the challenge. So if you're going to recruit a top CISO, you have to really engage with them around what the opportunity is, what the mission is of the organization, and why what they would be doing would make the difference. And I think you could say that about a lot of roles, but that's the real way I think that you can garner the talent that you need to help lead you in
You
this
also
transformation.
the reason I took the job with Tradeweb, because I liked what I did at the power company, it was fun. But the reason I made the change was because they gave me teeth. They said, you make the job what you want of it. And that's a rarity now, because most people, I was their first official CISO. They had people doing security, but they didn't have that CISO role. And I never thought I'd get that again, to build a team from scratch. So that's the reason I moved to that particular company. But yeah.
With us, with staff, maybe only half of them have computer science degrees. I was meeting with some folks yesterday that are within their first 2 or 3 years of their career. I mean, somebody has a degree in political science, somebody in history.
no, these are CISO people.
Just they work in our security
Security in general.
organization.
Security in general, yeah.
There's somebody, a statistician. They actually want to be an economist, and which is really why you come to the Fed. You want to be an economist, and things didn't work out. And they ended up, within 2 days of being on our team, they found a needle in the haystack that had been there for years that we didn't know about. So I think you have to kind of broaden your horizon. The other thing, when it comes to diversity, the cybersecurity workforce now is only like 10 or 11% female. So that's where you really have to look broader in terms of where you can get those folks.
I'm glad you mentioned, because I was interviewed as part of an article about women in IT in general, but particularly regarding cybersecurity. And a lot of people assume that cybersecurity is all about bits and bytes and cryptographic codes and so on. A lot of it is really involved, a lot of the social engineering, a lot of the human side, if you will, of things, for which women often are very good at, in some sense, in addition to other things. So there's a lot of getting the message out that there's a lot of different skills needed, and trying to get people who can be most effective at providing those skills.
This is kind of back to the point that I was raising before. I think that there's too much focus on the CISO, per se, and there's not enough focus on improving kind of the general security competence within the rest of the organization. I think the CISO can't do it alone, and I think that you could, but I mean, and I was in the panel about the future of IT, and one of the things that somebody on that panel said was that as IT is going to start to kind of dissipate into the rest of the business organization, then the role of the IT organization is going to be about keeping things secure, keeping things robust, and making sure that everything works together. So I think that kind of this security function needs to get distributed.
I'm glad you said that, because this is a conversation I had with a number of people at lunch today.
Yep.
This whole notion of how does one go about creating a cybersecurity culture within the organization. Obviously, the CIO and the CISO can do certain things and may provide a lot of the important leadership. I love to find examples all the time. So I noticed one downstairs as I was walking into the building. You may have noticed a little sign here that says that the doors are locked and you have to have an MIT card after, I forgot it was 11 p.m. or something. Now here's a question. It's raining outside. You're an MIT person. You unlock the door and someone is right behind you. How likely is it they're going to slam the door on that person and require that person to get their card out to let them in?
Yeah.
Now, the reason I say that, I'm not saying you should do that, by the way, but I'm just saying is making people cyber aware, because obviously this is not a cyber attack per se, but a lot of what causes cyber attacks is behavior like that, behavior that is well-intended, often not well thought through, and that's where whatever level or whatever role you have in the organization, you become the weakest link possibly. And so how to make people not just aware of this, but be able to think about it in an active way. By the way, I'm not suggesting you lock the door on me if it's raining outside, by the way. But I'm just saying, I see so many examples like that where our natural tendencies, in fact, are often counter to providing us the cybersecurity that we desire.
So I think that's where you have to celebrate the success, because you rely on your employees really to be that last entry point before something bad happens. And we had a recent case. We had a large phishing campaign that we were targeted in, and 30 employees were targeted, and not one of them clicked the email. Right? And we went around to each of them and said, hey, thank you very much. You guys saved the organization. And we also did that broadly so that people understand that stuff like this happens, and that we were prepared, and there were, people did the right thing.
That's wonderful. So I did save one question for the end. We have about 2 or 3 minutes left. So here's a question. I'm planning ahead for next year, if you will. Nothing wrong with forward thinking. So do you expect a year from now your cybersecurity concerns to have increased or decreased by then, and why? Don, you want to take the first crack at that?
Sure. So I think I would guess that they'll probably be the same in terms of the level and the level of concern, but I would envision it will be something different that we're focusing on. I don't know it could be a lot of stuff that we learn about here, or maybe something different.
I would venture a guess that they're going to increase over the next year. I guess that's the obvious answer, but the reason for that is that we're kind of pushing full throttle on digital, on transformation, on reworking a lot of our capabilities, and a lot of things that are bad that are happening at the application layer. That layer is becoming more and more complex all the time, with APIs, with different interfaces, with third parties integrating, and I just think that there's the attack surface is going to continue to increase because of that.
Lena?
Yep, I think it's going to increase, probably in the back of things like Brexit, GDPR regulations, but also maybe nation-state actors. There's a lot of things happening just now in the political world that may not have good outcomes. So that's all I'll say on that.
And finally,
Yeah, I guess my opinion would be is not whether, but just how much, right? So we'll accelerate, beyond what it has been, and the attack vectors are different. So I think we'll probably talk more about, machine to machine, traffic and the ramifications of that. True nation state, attacks against, as cyber warfare, not just, attacks on intellectual property, et cetera. So I think all of that, comes into play, and the,